relate to what has gone before. Now, thus far you've had a series of lectures by, I can't remember, yes, by Paolo Filippucci on identity and difference, and you've had Alan McFarlane here and Yael Navarro-Yassin talking to you about politics and economics, and you've also had a lecture series by Susan Bailey on theory. And I didn't attend these lectures, but in brief, although they've been given sexy new titles like identity and difference, really what they're about is a standard division in anthropology between kinship, economics, politics, and religion. And if Susan, I imagine that Susan Bailey described to you the fact that in some forms of functionalist theory, there's an idea that these institutions, kinship, politics, economics, and religion, fit together like a kind of machine or a human body. So that we could say that, politics is the head, economics is the belly, kinship is down here, reproduction and up here in the heart, etc. So that it's a functioning system. Now, what you haven't had any lectures on is on the subject of religion. And you ain't getting no lectures on the subject of religion. So you might ask the question, well, why not? And the answer is that these traditional divisions between kinship, economics, politics, and religion are quite useful for analytical purposes, and in societies with advanced division of labor, you can sometimes see the divisions, because people like Tony Blair talk about politics, and you live in a family, you can go to church, and you can go to the stock exchange. So we have institutions which clearly correspond to these divisions, or you might think they clearly correspond to these divisions, but in fact, of course, a moment's thinking will tell you that they are very artificial distinctions. So if you just take the example of religion, you would think that both George Bush and, well, let's take George Bush. George Bush is supposed to be a politician, but of course his religious ideology plays a very, very important part in his politics. So he talks about the axis of evil. And his arch enemy, Osama bin Laden, is the quintessence of evil in Bush's views, but of course Osama bin Laden is noted, or supposedly noted, for being the representative of Islamic fundamentalism. But it doesn't occur to George Bush that, of course, George Bush is a representative of another kind of fundamentalism. So here we see that the divisions between where politics ends and religion begins in the world of Bush and bin Laden is very difficult to tell. Now, so that although in advanced societies we have institutions which correspond to these divisions, if we go to, already the distinctions are muddy. If we go to tribal societies like the Trobrians, we see that this is even more fuzzy. So that those of you who have already read, and I recommend that you do so quickly if you haven't, those of you who've read Malinowski's Argonauts of the Western Pacific, the whole point of the book, we'll see that the whole point of the book is really to say that what looks like an economic institution, the cooler, is and isn't an economic institution. It doesn't make any sense in terms of what we understand by economics, and it would be extremely difficult to untangle or unscramble the economic bits of the cooler from the political, the economic, and all the rest of it. And again, that's part of the point of Malinowski's discussion. So that what we can conclude from this, and I don't know whether Susan Bailey explained this, but if we take the category functionalism, we can see that it has some rather ambiguous meanings, because on the one hand it connotes a set of ideas about, or images of society like a body and the bits fitting together. In other words, the bits function together to maintain social stability, etc. But on the other hand, the notion of functionalism also connotes ideas of tracing connections, and that's exactly what Malinowski is doing in his Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And Malinowski is actually very different from the I hope Susan Bailey mentioned Radcliffe Brown, who is the granddaddy of the body as society version of functionalism. But Malinowski is actually doing something rather different, because what Malinowski is doing is what later comes to be called thick description. In other words, he's putting the bits together and providing a kind of descriptive density in order to show how the bits all relate together descriptively. So that whereas Malinowski goes into description, Radcliffe Brown is more interested in analysis. Now, religion, as I've said, is an especially problematic category in all this. Now, typically, definitions of religion tend to imply the division of behavior or social institutions or objects into two kinds of things, so that on the one hand we have the rational, the technical, the material, the practical, and on the other hand we have the symbolic or the expressive. And very often we get ideas of some kind of relationship of determinism between the two, either a top-down determinism, so that symbolic things or ideas are more important or are in some sense prior to economic arrangements, which was the view taken by Durkheim. The sociologists will remember that name. And the opposite view was that taken by Marx, so that both Marx and Durkheim are really operating with the same schema. They're saying that we have a division between the mundane, economic, technical world and the sacred world of religion. And in Durkheim's idea was that we divided the world into the sacred and the profane, so that for Durkheim the sacredness had to do with religion, and the profane was quintessentially economic life. So what Durkheim is really writing about is he's saying if you were an Australian Aboriginal or a group of Australian Aborigines living in the Australian desert, most of the time you're hunting and gathering. In other words, you're engaged in rational, technical, mundane activities, which is the domain of the profane, but every so often you go and have a ritual, you get together, and that is the domain of the sacred or religion. And for Durkheim, it was the sacred which was the really real, and that was the master logic behind society and culture. Marx didn't use the categories sacred and profane, he used the categories infrastructure and superstructure. So that for Durkheim, the determinism is coming down from the top, whilst for Marx, the determinism is coming up from the bottom. So that for Marx, religion and politics and various other things were part of the superstructure, which on the one hand served to maintain economic relations, but also to mystify them. So here we have another important distinction. For Durkheim, religion is the really real, the truth in a sense, whilst for Durkheim it's a mystification. Now, this all looks very attractive in theory, but as I've tried to suggest, these distinctions between rational, irrational, practical or symbolic, material and ideological, etc., are very difficult to sustain in practice. And I want to give you two examples to demonstrate what I mean. And my examples come from technology. One of them has to do with some eel traps made by some people who live in the highlands of New Guinea called the Anka Ankave, and the other has to do with the design of modern aeroplanes. I have a liking for modern aeroplanes because I once learned to fly, having been accused of cannibalism and having won a libel case. So I thought, well, this is money from heaven, so I might as well spend it on something silly, so I learned to fly. So I like aeroplanes. Anyhow, let's begin with the Anka eel traps. Now, what happens amongst the Anka is that at the end of mourning, the lineage of the dead person has to give a whole mass of eels to the mother's brother of the dead person. And it doesn't matter, the details are not particularly important here. Now, these eels, they're about that long, not very long, and they're pretty small and very easy to catch. But for some reason, and this is a bad drawing of an ancave eel trap. It's like a funnel. The eels go in and they can't reverse outwards, so they get stuck. And what the ancave do is to make it's a sort of cone made of pieces of slats of palm wood, and then they bind it together with massively thick vines. Now you'd ask the question, why on earth, if the eels are so feeble and can't, they're not going to escape anyhow, why do you make this huge, robust trap in order to trap some eels? Well, the answer lies in the story about eels, and the story goes as follows, that once upon a time, long ago, there was a man who had an enormously long penis. And he used to lie in his bed at night, and his penis used to wander off in the middle of the night. And it went into the first bed, and it made love to the first woman, and then it went off and it did it to the second woman and the third woman, etc. And he was very happy lying in his bed. And the other men got very angry because, on the next night they'd sort of fondle their wives and they'd say, "No, not tonight, darling, I'm very tired," or "I've got a headache," etc., all that stuff. And they couldn't understand what was going on. What's wrong with our wives? Why don't they love us anymore? And then one night somebody stayed up late at night to see what was going on, and he saw this terrible revelation about this enormous mobile penis. So he took his knife and chopped it up into little pieces, in fact very small pieces, as you know, size matters, and each man was given a little piece of the penis, which is why they have their little members today. And at the same time, this long penis turned into all the eels in the world. So and the eels are fatty and very rich and nutritious. So what is basically being said in this story is that when my brother dies and my lineage gives eels to our mother's brother, what we're doing is showing how tough and strong and macho we all are, notwithstanding the fact that our own equipment is rather feeble and the eels are rather feeble. So in order to emphasize just how big the gift really is, they put huge creepers to make it as if the eels are bursting to get out of the trap. In other words, the trap is really a statement about potency, vitality and virility, and not much to do with the problems of how to catch eels. So that a rational piece of technology, an eel trap, says a great deal about the way these people think. Here is an aeroplane. It's a very remarkable aeroplane. It's called the Beach Starship. Brilliant at flying. We need to focus it a bit. It's not a very good picture. Anyhow, you can see that it's very good. It flies beautifully, but it was a commercial disaster. Now, why do you think it was a commercial disaster? Well, the answer is because it's back to front. It doesn't look right, because it's got its wings, it's got its front wings at the back and its back wings at the front. So, notwithstanding the fact that it's actually one of the best aeroplanes of its kind, it's a commercial disaster and it's no longer being produced. So here we have an example from our own society in which what should be, if we were operating simply on technological grounds, we would buy this aeroplane and fly in it happily, but it doesn't work anyhow. So what does all this tell us? Well, it tells us that the ideas like the practical or the technical or the symbolic, or distinctions between practical, technical and symbolic expressive, are simply analytical abstractions. They don't really map very tidily onto the real world, and that in real life things that we use, for instance, are imbued with both practicality and meaning. And the same applies to institutions. These are not types but aspects of institutions or aspects of objects, etc. So that the church has political aspects to it, etc. Now the second point, and this is really the crunch of these lectures in a sense, is that what anthropologists frequently call religion, what we call So what people call religion and ritual in other societies, in other words, the bits that make them scratch their head because they can't understand it rationally, is very much, this idea of religion when applied to other societies is very, very close to the notion of culture in our own society. And in fact, in common parlance, sometimes people elide the two ideas, so that sometimes people say in a rather loose sense, it's against my religion to eat meat, etc. And they don't really mean it's against my religion. What they mean, it's part of my self-image that I don't eat meat, etc. It's not true of me, I do eat meat. But, of course, culture is also a very, very serious issue. It's a matter also of warfare, and I'll come back to this point in a minute. So what I want to do in these lectures is really to explore the idea. I want to begin by exploring what the hell culture is, because it's a word which trips off people's tongues very easily. A word of easy virtue, as I said in your abstract, but it's in fact an extremely difficult and confusing word which is shot through with all sorts of ambiguities. And I want to look a little bit at how this is. What are the ambiguities? So I want to explore how anthropologists have, or some ways, I can't be exhaustive, but I want to deal with some of the ways that anthropologists have looked at culture in various societies. And I'm using this conjunction of the symbolic and the real, or the practical and the ideological, as the framework through which I'm going to do this. And I want to do it by looking at the relationship between the meaningful and the material or practical aspects of a whole lot of very familiar things around us, things which very often we take for granted in our own society, but which, if you're doing field research as an anthropologist, you are immediately struck by. The fact I want to deal with things like animals, the human body, houses, people's notions of time, people's ideas about food, etc. Very ordinary things which are the real stuff of anthropological fieldwork, because when you're actually doing anthropological fieldwork, it doesn't come in the messy reality of life is not divided tidily into the categories which anthropologists use in their descriptions and analyses. And I wanted, so that on the one hand I'm bearing in mind theoretical issues, but I want to deal with them through very down-to-earth, homely examples. Okay, so that's really what the lectures are about, and bye-bye aeroplanes. Let us get down to culture. Quite a lot of information is compressed onto this sheet, but you've got it in front of you too. Now, culture is probably the key, or one of the most important anthropological concepts. It's often taken as the defining, but particularly by American anthropologists, is taken as the defining term for the anthropological enterprise as a whole. But it's also, if you think about it for a moment, it's the dominant idea or obsession, one might say, of the day. We are surrounded by talk of culture. We're told that multiculturalism is a very good thing. We see disputes between various kinds of subcultures, whether those are a good thing, whether French Muslims wearing veils, is this tolerable or not tolerable, etc. So these are subcultures. What is the relationship between Islamic people in France and French culture as a whole? How do we reconcile this sort of problem? We talk about cultural imperialism, cultural resistance, cultural autonomy. And if you go into if you watch the telly, what's the bloke who does Tribes? I can't remember his name. I couldn't bear watching it. Who was this guy? Anyhow, you know the one who did Tribes. Well, he's all about vanishing cultures. That's another one. So that cultures are presented like species, that this awful thing that in the Amazon rainforest, on the one hand, they're chopping down the trees, and in a metaphorical sense, they're chopping down the Indians too. They're all going to disappear together. The idea of cultures disappearing is a very strong image in our contemporary world. So, and you can see from all this that there are some very clear reasons why the notion of culture is not only popular and with us all the time, but it's also debated and it's a highly contentious issue, which leads people to go on demos, kill each other, and all the rest of it. Now, the ambiguity, and the other point I want to make is that this idea of culture is feeding, a lot of it is feeding from anthropological ideas into society and back through into anthropology again, or sociology, so that there is a circular route of these ideas from the world of academia into society and back into academia again. Now, one of the reasons that culture is extremely ambiguous is because it's constantly opposed to a lot of rather different other terms, amongst which we have it being opposed to nature, so that in principle at least, those of you who are doing Arc and Anth, you deal with nature in biological anthropology and culture in social anthropology. So here we have nature, culture, and with that we get minds and bodies, that the physical anthropologists deal with the bodies and the social anthropologists deal with the minds, etc. But of course they don't, it's not quite as easy as that. But then we have another opposition, which is the idea that culture is opposed to barbarism. We are cultured, they lack culture, they're savages, and that was an idea which dominated anthropology in the early days. Then we have a distinction between culture and society. Society is sort of real things like politics, economics, and kinship, tangible, whilst culture is the kind of the ideological or cultural froth on top of it all. And then we have yet another distinction, which is my culture versus another culture. Now, in each of these contrasts, and one could go on and produce a whole lot more, in each of these contrasts, what culture is actually changing. It's morphing depending on the contrast, the context in which it's found. If we look at a brief history of how the concept comes into the English language, and here I borrow from a book by Raymond Williams, a rather good book called Keywords. What Raymond Williams shows, he does a sort of archaeology of culture and shows us that in the beginning the word culture was a verb which had to do with an activity. In other words, it was the cultivation principally of plants and by extension of animals. And we find that still in our idea of agriculture. But once we have the idea of culture as an activity, then we can get culture as the product of that activity, so that we have something like we could call, medics talk about tissue cultures, which is the product of nurturing something. Then we get a metaphorical jump, because if you can culture things, then obviously you can culture yourself. So that in my days we used to do, I don't know what you call it today, but when I was at school we did something called physical culture. The idea was that you were sort of clean in thought, word and deed and body, so that you were upright not only in your bodies but upright in your thinking and your morality too. So that then we have the culture of the self, and again the derivative idea that if the self is cultured, then the self produces cultured things. So then we get the idea of culture as the product. So we have material culture, go to the arts, crafts, etc. So that we have again the jump from the activity to the product. And then, of course, people start dividing out the products, because some people's products are rather better than other people's products. So we get high culture. We have high culture and they have low culture. We have arts, science and civilization, whilst they, be they barbarians or other classes, etc., have low culture. So that we get distinctions like, if you go to the Fitzwilliam, you get art, high culture, and you have to go to the Museum of Arc and Anth to get primitive art, which is kind of low culture. It's ghettoized, it's put in another place. And we get the distinction between, and then we get the whole rise of the notion of popular culture. etc. So that here we get the idea that culture can be normative and that there are evaluative differences between cultures. Anthropologists don't, or in theory, don't buy into that sort of thing, but as I say, these ideas come back to haunt them periodically. Now, from this history of culture come the two main uses, the two main anthropological understandings of culture itself. The first one comes from Taylor, and the second one, Taylor was a Brit, Lowy was an American. Tyler's definition of culture Tyler defines culture as follows: the complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities acquired by man and woman as a member of society. So what Tyler is saying is everybody's got culture, and it's something that the great thing about culture is it is an acquired capacity of some kind. It's learned. And the notion that everybody has culture leads to the idea of anthropology as the study of culture in the singular. In other words, one of the questions at the heart of anthropology is, what is culture? What is this thing which we all seem to have and animals don't seem to have? In other words, the question is, what is this single unified human attribute? And this is what this curious, actually I better use another diagram. Let's use the more clear diagram. So what Tyler is saying is that culture, here is Tyler's culture, number 6. Tyler is saying everybody's got culture, but it isn't, you can't see it, but it's acquired rather than biologically given. In other words, it's there on the side of culture, things which are acquired, not on the side of nature, which is given by nature. But it's a universal pan-human characteristic. So that paradoxically, culture is in the nature of human beings, and yet something which is not natural in another sense. Now, Lowy's definition of culture is very different. Lowy defines culture as the diversity of habitual ways of thinking and living, each equally valid and with their own criteria of judgment. So that Lowy's definition is here, that cultures are acquired, but in the plural, everybody has one, but they're all different. So he's emphasizing diversity. So that paradoxically, on the one hand, anthropology is the study of all of us because we're all the same, but it's also the study of all of us because we're all different. And that there's a great deal of theoretical, the theoretical implications of that problem go on and on and on today. Now, this sounds all very well. It sounds as if we've got a tidy distinction between nature and culture, mind and body, etc. But in fact, for a long time actually, a lot of research has begun to question this. So that, for instance, normally it's assumed that human beings are unique precisely because they have culture, but it turns out that they're not unique in their capacity for culture. Birds have transmitted culture, chimps have transmitted cultures, all sorts of creatures have culture in the sense of learned capacities which are transmitted and not given by their genetic makeup. And in fact, you get subcultures. I don't know whether they don't seem to do it anymore, but there was a time when you couldn't leave your milk bottle outside your house because the blue tits used to come and peck open the thing. Now, people studied how this happened, and it was shown very clearly that it was a kind of fashion amongst the blue tits. Hey boys, look, there's a milk bottle. Now, a friend of mine has told me that if you peck the top, you get this delicious creamy stuff on the top of the milk. So that this new fashion amongst blue tits spread across Britain. It seems to have died out now. I don't know what they're into at the moment. But so there is culture amongst blue tits. Now, the other point is that if we take the example of language, it's actually very difficult to know where nature begins and culture ends, because it appears to be the case that babies of course don't, as you realize, they don't get born speaking English, but they certainly are born with a kind of capacity to learn languages. It isn't that it isn't the case that babies simply sit there as sort of passive sponges saying, "Ooh, cat, new word, dog, new word, eat, new word," and sort of build it up like that. Not at all, it doesn't work like that. What seems to be happening is that interaction is triggering innate mechanisms which allow the child to learn its language. And depending on which particular interaction it gets, it starts learning a particular set of sounds and words, etc. In other words, this tidy distinction between nature and culture is very problematic, because there are certain aspects of culture which seem to be also here as well as there. But on the other hand, if we go down that route and start saying that all of culture is innate and genetic, we get into racism, which is precisely this idea here, that people are genetically endowed to eat curry or fish and chips or whatever else they eat. In other words, that cultural differences are genetically programmed, which they obviously aren't. Now, so we have a distinction between Tyler's view and Lowey's view of what culture is about. Now, as you can see, Lowey's view, when Lowey says that, what did he say? Yes, the diversity of habitual ways of thinking and living, each equally valid. Lowey is a good he's a good liberal and a good cultural relativist. That there's no such thing as high cultures and low cultures, each one must be taken on its own merits. Well, that sounds all right, but if you were working with the Jivaro in Amazonia and they said, "We're going off to capture somebody's head," what would you do? Would you say, well, that was equally valid? Well, of course, it's good ethnography, great fun, but what about the people who have their heads taken? Not very easy. And what about Nazism? Nazism was a very clear culture, and yet I don't know whether we would say it was equally valid, so that there are some problems about relativity in this sense. But there are some good reasons also for adopting this view. So this is the relativistic view of cultures as equally valid, and this is the one in which we get multiculturalism, cultural autonomy, etc. A moment's thought also, if Lowey is correct that not only do people have culture, but it's divided into cultures in the plural, then you start asking the question, well, where do we stop with the divisions? Are the Muslims wearing their veils in France part of French culture or not part of French culture? Well, they're obviously a subculture. And I'm sure many of you have experienced that some of you probably use words in your family that other people don't use, which are part of your familial culture. We have one, when people wash up angrily, you can wash up as a sort of a statement of, well, I'm being a martyr. It's bloody well your turn to do the washing up, but you can wash up very aggressively if you like. Well, we call that tudging, but I bet you don't, so this is my family culture. So, and then of course we have individual cultures. Look at you all dress differently today, etc. So that you have your own style. So that, of course, we can take culture right down here and even down to there, because what you're doing in your own personal culture is also partly, but not totally, to do with your genetic makeup. It's not nice to say this, and the implications of this are very, very deep indeed, but I think the good old 60s days in which we said that the differences between men and women were entirely social is actually quite problematic, but we won't go into that because you'll start throwing things at me. Okay, so we have the first problem is the problem of culture versus cultures, and this is, as I say, an anthropological conundrum which still runs and which will run throughout these lectures. We also, as I say, have the problem about high cultures and universal culture, that some cultures seem better than others. And this is one of the points that postmodernism is very interested in. Because if you follow the logic, if you follow Lowy's logic, which says that each culture is equally valid, then you start thinking about, well, what is anthropology, sociology, philosophy, history, etc.? Aren't they part of our culture? Other cultures don't seem to do it in the same way. If you look at the ways in which people talk, think, etc., history in different societies, they're rather different. So how do we claim that our culture has the authority that our culture is somehow outside the loop? We look down as kind of eagles on the diversity of culture and say, well, we can analyze them all, but isn't our own culture entering into our analytical ideas? Well, it clearly is entering into our analytical ideas in very profound ways. And I don't know whether Paolo Filippucci talked about the problems about our own views of kinship. For instance, we happen to prioritize, in certain respects, we prioritize ideas of reproduction and biology in our own views of kinship, so that we talk of blood relatives. But there are other societies in the world which don't prioritize in the same way ideas of biology and reproduction in kinship. But our particular ideas of kinship have informed our theories of kinship. So the problem there is, on the one hand, that our own cultural preconceptions are not, in other words, that there's a limit to the extent to which we are outside the loop and scientific. And if you take the relativistic position to its extreme, then you would say, well, simply that our view of the world is simply our cultural view of the world, and all cultures are equally, all systems of explanation are equally valid. I don't myself buy into that in its crude form, but I see why it might be argued as such. There's another one also, there's another ambiguity, which is that culture is ambiguous in the sense that, particularly, for instance, in the anthropological view, we're saying that culture is the way of life of them. They have culture, so we talk about Trobriand culture or Samoan culture, etc. So that's something that we observe out there. But also, culture is about identity. We have culture is what makes us what we are. I saw a very nice illustration of this some time ago. I was asked by the Indians I work with in Amazonia to come back, and sort of, come back, Stephen, all is forgiven. We know you've ripped off our culture, but that's more or less what they said. I used to pick up my notebooks and say, how much are you going to sell this one for? It's really full now, isn't it? What do they pay you in the university for all this culture that you've written down? So they had this idea that I was a sort of culture vulture, eating up their culture, taking it back to Cambridge University, where they paid me an absolute fortune. Little did they know. But anyhow, I then got a message saying, come back because we're losing our culture. Will you help us develop an educational system which will preserve our culture? So they've learnt this word culture by now. And they think of it as something which is sort of trickling away through their fingers under the pressure of missionaries and various other people. So we had a week-long seminar in a Indian longhouse, and the seminar was about what is culture, because unless we know what culture is, we can't preserve it. So this was their idea, not mine. So we sat around in a big circle discussing what culture was, and they all stood up and said, well, we know what our culture is. It's the feathers we wear on our heads, and we dance and we sing. That's our culture. And then some bright spark, and of course you can imagine the setup. There was all men in the middle of the room chatting away like this, and the women were outside at the door sort of peeping in, saying, what the hell are these boys doing? Anyhow, after a long time, because it's only the men who wear feathers and paint, one of the men said, well, hang on a minute, if culture is all about dancing and singing and sacred activities and all that, surely women must have culture somewhere. So, women, come in. They sat them down in a row and they said, what's culture? Where is your culture? And the women said, God, I don't know. Search me, can't. And then one of them said, oh, well, I know what it is. We go into the gardens and we grow things. That's our culture. We teach our daughters how to grow manioc. And they said, gosh, that's very important. Yes, of course, culture isn't just feathers and paint. Culture is also activities. So that they switched from saying culture is what makes us special, what makes us Indians as opposed to you lot, to saying, well, culture is really how we live. So that they had made this jump between the outsider's view of culture, or the culture as identity, through to the more anthropological idea. Now, in other words, what do we conclude from all this? Well, I've given you a sort of metaphorical chain in which culture starts with agriculture and ends with culture with a capital K, as in the German. And I've suggested that the uncontrolled metaphors which are hidden in this chain of events come back to haunt the anthropological project in various ways. And they make culture highly problematic. And that is, I think, why culture is highly contested. The debates really do matter. Why do they matter? Well, they matter academically because people need to be clear what they're talking about, but they also matter practically. It's a matter of life and death. For those of you who remember the ghastly things that went on in Bosnia, will remember that people killed each other on the grounds, basically, of culture. Or that's what they were. That was the argument, that we can't have Muslims living in our village, etc. So that culture is, and what you take as the nice liberal idea of multiculturalism, the idea that everybody has the right to be different, etc., can have some slightly dangerous consequences. We see it in Britain at the moment. It's no longer pucker to say, well, I don't like them because they're black. No, I've got nothing against black people. It's their culture. It's something about that. They don't have our culture like we do. It's so that we have a kind of cultural racism which has substituted for the previous overt racism. Okay, well, I just want to end up by talking briefly about how anthropologists try to deal with this conundrum, about particularly the conundrum that culture is in some sense the same all the world over, and it's also different. Do you remember Nancy Banks Smith? Well, she's still going, actually. She's a brilliant telecritic in The Guardian. Nancy Banks Smith once said, anthropologists who tell you that people all over the world are the same except when they're different. And that more or less sums up the conundrum. So how do anthropologists deal with all this? Well, the traditional anthropological focus has been mainly on cultural diversity, so that in loose parlance, and even in anthropological parlance, people talk about tribes. And those of you who are taught by me in King's will now see why I keep scrubbing the word tribe out of your essays. Different society, we have this idea that the world is divided up into cultures or tribes, each with its own culture, which, as I say, are useful but sometimes highly problematic idea. Why is it problematic? Well, one of the problems is, where the hell do tribes end, or where do cultures end? Find me the boundary. If you go from down through France towards Spain, you come to a political frontier, and you used to have to go through customs and all that. Now we're in the EU, we don't so much, but you don't see a clear cultural distinction on one side and the other side of the border. Linguistically, one side fades into the other, socially, politically, etc. It's all a matter of degree. And also, things don't match up neatly, so that you don't get nice mappings between, we think, because we have this idea, which is essentially a nationalistic idea, that culture, religion, language, descent, and territory all match up together, so that's the basis of ethnic cleansing, is the idea that people should be all related, live in the same place, speak the same language, and have the same religion. But the world doesn't operate like that in real life. Where I work in Amazonia, you have to marry a spouse who speaks a different language from yourself, which is not a recipe. They didn't invent this idea for sort of marital harmony. It's simply that they rather unusually use language as a badge or a way of signaling the fact that you are in different intermarrying groups. So that you have some 25 different languages, but in other respects these people are all the same culture. But of course, the different language groups live in different places, so that the word tribe in this context is extremely confusing. Nonetheless, the Colombian government allocates the tribes tribal territories, and the American Protestant missionaries go and translate the Bible into each of these languages of these so-called different tribes. It's actually rather like translating the Bible into Geordie, London Cockney, Dorset, or whatever other dialect you would like to have in Britain. So the idea of tribe is not very clear. Also, we see that culture is very often not something which is in the middle, but actually something which happens on the edge. Cultures are manifest in interaction, so that, for instance, when you see cultural displays at their height, think about the Olympic Games, and the Welsh trot out, they wear top hats and carry leeks around, and the Scots dress up in kilts, and the Germans have beer tankers and all the rest of it. So everybody is there producing culture as a system to signal differences, so that culture here is being displayed not, Welsh people normally don't eat very many leeks and don't wear top hats, but under certain interactive conditions they have to do this. So that culture is on the margins in interaction. But there's a further problem, which is really this, that if you take the view of culture, of the world as divided into cultures or tribes, what are you going to do about the fact that anthropology is really also supposed to be a generalizing account of human culture as a whole, as Tyler put it. And there have been really two takes on this, the two quite opposed ways of dealing with this. On the one hand, functionalism and also hermeneutics and various other things have tended to focus on the differences. So that if we take the proposition of functionalism, the proposition of functionalism is a liberal, anti-racist position to begin with. What they say is, look, we know that culture is not innate, because if we take a Chinese baby and bring it up in Britain, it will become functionally and culturally British, and if we take a British baby and bring it up in China, it will become culturally and functionally Chinese. So that this point we take as the underlying assumption of our anthropological enterprise, that everybody is the same. We know that's not the problem. And we then proceed, but then rather paradoxically, we then proceed to demonstrate infinite differences. And we use it actually rather dangerously, insidiously, on the model sometimes of the natural sciences. So that if you follow the logic of Radcliffe Brown's argument that that a culture is rather like an integrated human body, it's not actually very far away from the idea to say that cultures are bounded entities rather like species. So that we classify societies into hunters and gatherers, pastoralists, agriculturalists, etc. We classify them into patrilineal and matrilineal, so that starting from the unity, we endlessly subdivide. Some years ago, Prince Charles got very upset because, I can't remember why he was intervening, but Prince Charles used to sit, not in this room, but I started my lecturing career lecturing to Prince Charles. You had to mind your P's and Q's in those days. But anyhow, Prince Charles learned anthropology, so that he got hold of this sort of liberal multiculturalism idea, but at the same time he got very worried about the fact that anthropologists were, in a sense, increasing racism in Britain. And the point he was making was precisely that anthropologists had this tendency to classify societies out into discrete, different others, and that this is dangerous. So that functionalists then start with the idea that we're all the same, but they run the risk of demonstrating that we're all different. Now, but there is another way of another version of this, which is I hope Susan Bailey talked about structuralism. I'll come back to that point in a minute. What structuralists did, or Levi-Strauss did, was really to start at the other end. He said, look, the evidence is that cultures are all manifestly different. They're not the same at all. What we perceive is endless difference. And the real problem, what the functionalists took for granted, the structuralists took as the problem, they said we must demonstrate. How are we going to demonstrate, not assume, the underlying unity of cultures? And they did so by taking a cue from linguistics. And the cue was really very simple and actually not it turns out to be much less useful than they had assumed. But the point was basically this. All known languages in the world, there are many, many different ones, and they all have a very different content, but they all work or they all appear to work in the same way, which is that they at the very basic level, they're built up of contrasts between sounds. Those of you who've seen Lost in Translation will remember that was one of the jokes in the film, is that the Japanese don't make the same distinctions as we do between different sounds, so that we titter endlessly about the fact that Japanese say flied lice, but the Japanese would probably titter at us because we would make equivalent mistakes as them when we try and speak Japanese. So that what is happening here is that each language selects a pair, or a whole mass of paired sounds which are differences which make a difference. And it happens to be the case that in English the distinction between r and l makes a difference. So that if I say I'm late, it's a one word, whilst it's the rate of exchange is a different word. So that the contrast r, l carries meaning in English. It doesn't carry meaning in Japanese. But you people are very happy if you, sorry King students, I've said this before, but if you take the in bed and the in roses, and you say it in your head, I don't know how you speak, but in my speaking, I say for bed and u for roses. But we happily write them as if they're the same sound, but actually they're not the same sound at all. But because it doesn't, this and u carries no meaning in it, the contrast carries no meaning, we're happy to pretend that they're the same sound, or we represent them. In the language I speak in northwest Amazonia, you means I, and ye is a kind of bird, so that for them, and u carry meaning. Okay, so the proposition of structuralism was simply that each language is made up of a set of paired sounds. And what structuralism then said, well, maybe cultures work like languages, and to an extent they do. I had a slide, but I couldn't find it, of college colours. Now, if you take the example of college colours, if you ask people, if you say, why do brides wear white, people will trot out stories about purity, virginity, etc. If you ask the question, well, why do people in King's wear purple, you might say, oh, well, they're all pinko gays, or it's a royal college and all the rest of it. But if you then say, well, why do people in Queen's wear green? Well, it's not because they're all ecological. It doesn't work like that. What actually happens is that it's an analogical system of differences. All that is happening is that the difference between purple, green, black, I can't remember all your college colours, but you know, we could have a series of college colours. The differences between the colleges' colours are like the differences between the colleges themselves. So that we're not dealing with meaning here at all, we're simply dealing with a code system. Now, I must stop here because time has run out, but I want to explore these ideas. On the one hand, you can go down the meaning route, but if you go down the meaning route, you're bound to go culturally specific. Take the question, why do brides wear white? Well, they happen to wear white in England, and that's all about purity, but there are other countries in which brides wear black. Why do they wear black? Because it's a very solemn occasion, etc. And there are places in the world where brides wear black and widows wear white, whilst we wear white at weddings and black at funerals. Now, the content is different, but the patterning is the same. So that if you look at pattern and form, you can go towards culture as the universal, but if you start looking at meaning, you're back in the realm of cultures in particular. You're back in the realm of interpretation. So that's the end of my lecture for today, but that's what I want to expand upon a little bit in later lectures. Thank you.